today's mindful moment. Ever get the feeling that, like, those really big ideas, the ones that kind of shake up how you see the world, shouldn't have to come from, years of studying in some secluded library? Like,
Yeah.
shouldn't we be able to find deep understanding right in the middle of our crazy, busy lives? Just a random thought and a new perspective.
Well, I think that's exactly the spirit we're bringing to today's deep dive. Welcome, everyone. We're here, ready to dig into some really fascinating ideas to give you the essence of what's important. No need to wade through mountains of books. Think of it as your express lane to knowledge.
Today, we're tackling the connection between philosophy and religion. We'll be exploring this through Frederick Copleston's Religion and Philosophy, which is a pretty insightful read.
Absolutely. He really unpacks how these two, almost fundamental parts of being human have been tangled up throughout history, from the nature of reality itself to how we form beliefs.
Our mission today is to pull out some of Copleston's key arguments. We want to understand humanity's drive to make sense of existence, the different ways we approach belief, and how thinkers have wrestled with those age-old big questions. Those questions we all have at some point. And hopefully along the way, we can offer some food for thought, maybe even spark some of those aha moments.
Precisely. Moments of clarity and inspiration amidst the everyday chaos. We're calling those mindful moments on our new AI audiobook analysis YouTube channel, by the way, but more on that later.
All right, so let's jump in. One of the first things Copleston throws out there is this idea that even metaphysics, which often sounds like this super abstract branch of philosophy, can have a religious flavor. Now, when we think of religion, our minds don't usually go there, right?
You're right. It's more about, organized worship, rituals, a belief in some higher power, something like that. Professor C.A. Campbell even defined religion as a belief in these super powerful, worthy, supernatural beings and the acts of reverence that go with it.
So then you have something like early Buddhism, which, with its focus on ethics, might fit more neatly into a philosophical box than a religious one.
That's an interesting point. It makes you wonder if maybe we need a wider lens to look at religion.
And Copleston does suggest that. He's saying religion might be more about those ultimate concerns, the values and ethics that we really truly hold dear.
It's about what really matters to us at the deepest level. It ties in with Professor Charles Morris's idea of a focal attitude, the way we orient our lives around certain values or goals. Copleston argues that when philosophies do this, when they offer these guiding principles, they kind of step into a role similar to religion, even if there aren't any traditional religious structures. So maybe religion isn't so much about gods and rituals as it is about those core values, the things that hold ultimate importance.
Right, but he also points out where philosophy and religion diverge. Like, we wouldn't call a philosophy a religion because, well, it often lacks those communal elements like worship.
Right, like J.S. Mill pointed out when he talked about Comte's positivism and his religion of humanity. Plus, religions often rely on revelation as a source of belief, while philosophy is supposed to be all about reason and logic. You wouldn't say, read Plato's Republic with the same reverence as you would, say, a sacred text.
But Copleston argues that, historically, metaphysics has been deeply tied to this human need for purpose and direction. For a long time, philosophies weren't just these abstract ideas in classrooms. They were frameworks for understanding our place in the universe, giving people guidelines for living a meaningful life. Which, in a way, shows how these seemingly out-there ideas actually come from very human needs.
Exactly. And that brings us to what Copleston calls transcendent metaphysics. He sees it as a way of expressing that deep desire for an ultimate explanation, a journey from the many, many things we experience to that one unifying principle.
So it's like this search for a fundamental unity behind everything.
And Copleston suggests that in transcendent metaphysics, the existence of this foundation, is assumed from the get-go. The act of searching implies that there's something to find. It reminds me of a quote by F.H. Bradley. Quote, "Philosophy demands, and in the end it rests on what may fairly be termed faith. It has, we may say, in a sense, to presuppose its conclusion in order to prove it." So are we already believing in what we're searching for? That's a question that philosophers have pondered for centuries.
It's like we're not starting with a completely blank slate. If we're searching for this ultimate reason for everything, are we already assuming it's out there? It's not just about solving a puzzle, but about having this underlying conviction.
Ian Copleston goes even further, suggesting that this conviction often comes from a particular way of experiencing the world around us. It's like a seeing of things as being dependent on this unseen one, almost like an intuition. It's that feeling that the things we see aren't self-sufficient, they rely on something beyond themselves. You know how kids constantly ask why? They're not satisfied with simple answers. They want to get to the root of things.
So in a way, transcendent metaphysics is a more refined version of that. It's our human drive to find the ultimate why behind everything.
Exactly. And Copleston points out that thinkers like Plotinus, way back in the 3rd century, saw philosophy as a path to this one.
But someone might be thinking, okay, maybe some folks have these experiences, and maybe they even inspire whole philosophies. But does that mean these experiences are actually giving us real knowledge? Can we really find objective truth this way?
You're right to be cautious. Just because something happens in someone's mind doesn't automatically make it true. You can have the experience without accepting all the grand theories attached to it.
Copleston seems to get that. He's not saying we have to accept every claim, but he is arguing that transcendent metaphysics can have a religious feel to it. The two aren't necessarily separate categories.
Now, what's interesting is the distinction Copleston makes between ideas and beliefs. He borrows this from Ortega y Gasset. Ideas are things we actively think about. We can choose to entertain them or not. But beliefs are those deep-seated assumptions of a culture, the stuff we often don't even realize is shaping our worldview.
And he's saying that philosophy often pops up when those deeply held beliefs are questioned. It's like when the foundation starts to crumble, that's when philosophers come in, trying to build new systems of thought to replace those fading beliefs.
Exactly. It's like a response to a cultural crisis of faith.
Think about ancient Greece. Religion was more about rituals and practices than strict doctrines. So when philosophers speculated about the gods, it wasn't always about rebelling against religion, but more like trying to figure out the assumptions behind those rituals.
They already believed in the gods. The philosophers were trying to use reason to understand them better.
Then you have Christianity coming along with a whole new way of seeing the world. So the early Christians had to figure out how to deal with all these existing philosophical schools of thought.
And their responses were all over the place. Some were totally against philosophy, believing that divine revelation trumped everything else. Others saw some value in it, like maybe it paved the way for Christianity.
But it seems like the main idea was that Christian revelation replaced philosophy.
Though figures like Thomas Aquinas in the medieval period tried to bridge the gap, especially between Aristotelian thought and Christian doctrines. He saw Aristotle's philosophy as the peak of human knowledge and tried to show how reason and revelation could coexist.
But even Aquinas was primarily a theologian. He was using philosophy to understand his faith, not just building philosophical systems for fun.
Right. And even within Christianity, there's this tension between the God of the philosophers and the God of the Christian religion. Some thinkers noticed that philosophical ideas about God didn't always line up with the Christian view of a personal God with will and freedom. Take William of Ockham, for example. He stressed God's absolute power, saying morality is tied to God's will, not some external standard.
And that tension leads to a bigger point. Some theologians worry that metaphysics, in its quest to explain everything, might actually hurt faith. By making God too abstract or suggesting we can fully grasp God with our minds, metaphysics might become a rival to faith.
Think about Spinoza's pantheism. He basically said God and nature are one, which isn't really in line with traditional religious views.
And even when people like Hegel tried to put Christian beliefs into philosophical terms, it often didn't sit well with theologians. They worried that in trying to explain these mysteries with pure logic, you lose the essence of what they mean to people.
And then in modern times, there's been a lot of pushback against metaphysics itself, with a growing focus on language, especially in ethics. Some theologians might see this as putting philosophy back in its lane, stopping it from building grand systems that compete with religious authority.
Right, so philosophy becomes more about analysis. It looks at the logic and meaning of different ways we use language, including religious language, but it doesn't try to create a competing system. A theologian, focused on the language and practices of their faith, might see all that abstract thinking as a distraction, even misleading.
Copleston uses this analogy of a swimmer in a river to illustrate the philosopher's perspective. The swimmer only sees a small part of the river at once, and their view is shaped by the currents and their location. But what they see can still be real. The danger is if they think their little section represents the whole river and start making a map based on that limited view.
So the philosopher might be right about some things, but they risk distorting the bigger picture if they overgeneralize.
Like, take Schopenhauer, for example. He was obsessed with suffering and evil, and that led him to see ultimate reality as this blind, striving will. His view might seem one-sided, but he did highlight a real and important part of human experience, something any complete worldview has to deal with.
But Copleston is clear that he's not saying every philosophy fits perfectly with faith. They might focus on different things or approach questions from totally different angles. But he does say theology starts from a different place. The God of faith, the God revealed in Scripture and experienced through Christian life.
Exactly. Statements about God and theology aren't meant to be the result of philosophical arguments. They come from faith and understanding within a religious tradition.
He gives the example of trying to define God as personal by saying what God isn't, by negating human limitations. But if you push that too far, you might end up with an impersonal God, losing that personal relationship that's central to Christianity.
And that brings up R.M. Hare's Blick theory and Wittgenstein's idea of language games. A blick is basically a fundamental interpretation of the world, a lens through which we see things. Wittgenstein said that language works within these different games, each with its own rules and meaning. So maybe religious language has its own game that doesn't need to be justified by other kinds of logic.
So for a theologian, Christianity might be its own self-contained system with its own internal logic and understanding. Trying to explain it with outside arguments might just be missing the point.
However, Copleston does raise questions about these self-contained language games. Can we just ignore talk about God if that game is fading away in culture? Doesn't the question of whether there's good reason to believe in God still matter, regardless of the language used?
He suggests that even if theology starts with the God of faith, it should still explain its assumptions and offer reasons for its beliefs. It's not about creating a foolproof argument that convinces everyone, but about making clear what religious belief stands on.
And in modern philosophy, the focus has often shifted from proving God exists to questioning whether the idea of God even makes sense.
Like Sartre and the existentialists, they thought the very concept of God was contradictory. So from their perspective, the question of whether such a being exists might seem pointless.
But even this highlights how important the idea of God is for us. Existentialism, even when it's atheistic, shows that the question of God, even his absence, is something we can't just ignore.
Now let's talk about mysticism. These religious experiences have often been seen as giving special insights into reality.
Copleston agrees they're important, but he cautions against taking them as absolute proof of God. The problem is that these experiences are usually understood through the mystic's own beliefs. It's hard to have a pure experience, untouched by previous ideas.
So a mystic from one religion might describe their experience in their own faith's language, while a mystic from another faith might use completely different terms, making it tricky to find a universal, objective interpretation.
But Copleston does think there might be some common ground among mystics from different backgrounds, even if their explanations differ. They often talk about a direct connection with something beyond our senses and the limits of our individual selves.
Someone might say, hold on, if existing means being something we can experience with our senses, then these mystical claims about a reality beyond the senses just don't make sense.
But Copleston sees that as a bias, a specific idea about what's real. He says limiting reality to only what we can sense is also a kind of dogmatism, an unquestioned belief.
And even if there are psychological explanations for mystical experiences like altered states of consciousness, Copleston argues that doesn't automatically make the mystic's interpretation wrong. The two explanations, the psychological how and the personal meaning, can both be true.
So philosophy could start by assuming God exists and then try to understand all of human experience, including those mystical encounters, within that belief system. It's about creating a coherent worldview.
But Copleston is realistic. Proving any worldview is definitely a huge challenge. There will always be room for different interpretations, doubts, and perspectives.
Now, in Metaphysics Today, Copleston talks about Peter Straussen's idea of two kinds of metaphysics. Descriptive metaphysics explores how we already think about the world, the basic categories we use. Revisionary metaphysics aims to actually change those categories, offering a new way of thinking about reality.
Copleston believes the core problem of metaphysics is still the problem of the absolute, that ultimate reality we've been discussing. And he sees the history of metaphysics as this ongoing effort to understand it. He believes science has been important in refining how we do metaphysics.
And then there's the question of the self in metaphysics. Copleston argues that to even ask metaphysical questions, we have to step back from our immediate experience. The self, as a conscious being, has to be able to look at the world as an object and question it.
But the self is a tricky thing to fully grasp. Like David Hume said, when we try to look inward and understand the I, we don't find a separate, unchanging self. The I that's doing the looking seems to slip away.
Copleston uses the term metaphenomenal self to describe this principle that unifies our consciousness, the thing that makes it possible for us to experience the world. We can think and talk about this principle, but we can't experience it directly.
He also emphasizes that we're not just abstract minds, we're embodied spirits, connected to the world through our physical existence. And this connection, especially our experience of being finite, of having limits, of knowing we'll die, often leads us to think about the absolute, the unconditioned source of everything.
This leads us to the idea of desire in metaphysics. Some people criticize metaphysics, saying it's driven by a desire for the absolute, this dissatisfaction with the limitations of our world.
While desire might be part of it, Copleston argues that it's also an intellectual pursuit, a quest for understanding. This movement of transcendence, our attempt to go beyond the finite, is driven by reason, not just our wants.
He says this intellectual journey starts with our awareness of being in a world with tons of different things. Our reason, in its search for understanding, naturally wants to unify this diverse world.
He defines world, in this context, as this system of material things and how they relate to each other. And he says, we're tempted to see this world as the ultimate reality. But our reason sees how limited and dependent these things are, and it wants to find something more fundamental, something that doesn't depend on anything else.
He argues that a completely isolated thing, totally separate, wouldn't make sense to our minds. Think about it. Everything around us relies on other things to exist. Metaphysics pushes us to ask, is there anything that doesn't depend on anything else? What's the ultimate source?
In the last part, some objections considered, Copleston addresses the criticism that this movement of transcendence might not be purely rational. Some say, like Jasper's, that it's based on a kind of faith or a pre-existing desire for a certain reality. Copleston admits it's tough to prove this movement is absolutely necessary using logic alone. But he argues that the idea of being makes sense in itself. It's not just something philosophers made up.
So Copleston concludes that, at its heart, metaphysics is about this human desire for the transcendent, this deep need to understand the nature of reality.
To sum up, we've seen how wanting to understand the world can lead to a search for something beyond it. Philosophers and religions have explored this throughout history. And even without definite answers, thinking about these questions can give us those moments of insight and make us reflect on who we are and our place in the grand scheme of things.
Absolutely. And here's something to ponder as we wrap up. In your own search for meaning and purpose, do you feel this pull towards something bigger, something beyond the limits of what we can see and touch?
It's definitely something to think about. If this exploration of religion and philosophy has intrigued you, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into all sorts of captivating topics. And tell your friends.
And if you want to explore Copleston's Religion and Philosophy in more detail, we've included a link to buy it in the show notes. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating explorations. Thanks for joining us on this journey.